Alright, folks, welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about how governments develop according to the historical dialectical materialism from a Wabian Marxist perspective. Alright? So, basically this means that we're going to look at what the most primitive form of government is versus what the most advanced form of government is. So, first off, we've got monarchism. Now, we've got to kind of reference it with the last video a little bit. Because monarchism is supposed to exist, typically, during the time when primitivism exists. Basically, normally when we think of monarchism, we think of like the medieval era or the Middle Ages, but really that's not what's necessarily meant. You could also have a chiefdom. And also, when I'm talking about monarchism, I'm not talking about constitutional monarchism. I'm talking about absolute monarchism, where the monarch has absolute power in the government. So that's what I mean by monarchism. I just shorten it. But it could be a chieftain, and it probably would be called something like a chieftain under a primitivist society. But it's all monarchism. It's all basically the same thing. So let's just go ahead and get started. What is monarchism according to Wabian Marxism? Well, monarchism is where one person has absolute political power, meaning nobody can stand up to them. They are appointed through non-democratic means, and there's really nothing a person can do to either get into a monarchist's life or to, just get their issues represented either. So let's start off with authoritarian monarchism. So authoritarian monarchism is like early stage monarchism, basically. So authoritarian monarchism is where one person has absolute power and is uncontested. This person does not have to answer to anybody but themselves, and they are in charge of everybody. Authoritarian monarchism, it works really well with early primitivism because there isn't enough of a population to really contest the monarch, to really challenge the monarch in terms of power. So that is really actually the only real way that an authoritarian monarchy can actually exist. I'm sure there's probably some example out there where something wacky happened, but usually authoritarian monarchies can only happen in areas with very low population that are struggling. Alright? Then we have liberal monarchism. Liberal monarchism is where you get a little bit more population. You get a little bit more population and they get a little bit stronger. Basically, monarch has nobles that need to be pleased. So basically there is a noble class that is underneath the monarch, and collectively they have about as much power as the monarch has. Because the monarch has, due to logistics, to give over some of their power to the nobles. Alright? So then we have libertarian monarchism. Libertarian monarchism is basically the idea that the people, like the knights or police officers that enforce everything, they need to be pleased just as much as the nobles do. You still got nobles, but now you also got auxiliaries. Alright? So Auxiliaries form guilds that need to be pleased. So basically, in this society, the thin blue line really, really matters to the king or queen. Alright? But now the thing is, notice that there is a decrease in the concentration of power. Over here, you got one person with absolute power. And then in liberal monarchism, the monarch is forced to give over some of their power to a set of nobles. And then in libertarian monarchism, we have got to give the monarch and the nobles are forced to give over their power to the people that enforce it. All right? And so now it has become much, much easier to reach a point where you have at least some form of power. All you got to do is become like a knight or a police officer, which admittedly is easier said than done, but it is at least possible to the average person. Whereas becoming nobility, that's basically random, and being the monarch is basically impossible. All right, so let's keep that idea going, because that idea is going to continue to happen for the next few stages. So that's stage 1, monarchism. Now let's go to stage 2, dictatorship. And yes, I know this 2 is smaller than everything else, but Excel glitched out, so I couldn't change it. Alright, so dictatorship. Supreme leader is appointed outside of inheritance or military power. So basically here's the idea. Under monarchism, the monarch is appointed either by inheriting their position or by taking their position through military means, basically taking over the country. Whereas a dictatorship ain't like that. A dictatorship, the dictator becomes the dictator for different reasons, all right? So now let's go from libertarian monarchy to authoritarian dictatorship. This is where the leader is appointed by unelected nobles. So you see that noble class that was formed in liberal monarchy right here? Yeah, that noble class now has a whole lot more power. All right? So now not only are we expanding the amount of people that can have political power, we're now bringing some of that political power that's concentrated way up at the top down a level. All right? Now the nobles have enough power to elect the dictator. All right? So what happens in a liberal dictatorship? Now, I will point out, we often think of dictatorships as the most authoritarian thing in existence. However, liberal dictatorship is the most common form of dictatorship throughout history. By far. Even the most authoritarian societies had liberal dictatorships. All right? Now, an example of liberal dictatorship would be the USSR. The USSR was a liberal dictatorship. So what is a liberal dictatorship? Basically, a liberal dictatorship is where the nobles, they elect the dictator, but the people elect the nobles. All right? So now we got a pretty big deal. Now pretty much everybody's elected. So the USSR was liberal, and the only authoritarian dictatorship I can think of was Francoist Spain. because they still maintained their nobility during that time, and their nobility basically appointed Franco. Alright? But I'm sure there's probably more. It's just the vast majority of dictatorships were liberal dictatorships. Which means that even though liberal dictatorships are bad, they're not good things, they're still a hyper-authoritarian. At least they're not as bad as what it could be. Not good. There's a whole lot of improvement you could have. And you still need to resist them. But it could be worse. Let's just put it that way. It could be worse. It could be, well, I wouldn't say a lot. It wouldn't be a lot worse. It would just be a little bit worse. But now let's move on to the next stage. Libertarian dictatorship. This is where the supreme leader is directly elected by the people. Alright, kind of like the U.S. elects their president. It's kind of like that. Now, this is actually interesting because it turns out that Nazi Germany was a libertarian dictatorship, which is actually really shocking. It's actually really, really shocking, especially given that people under Nazi Germany were not, they were given less freedoms than the liberal dictatorship of the USSR. So, everything, but if you consider the economic system of the USSR versus Nazi Germany, you probably would figure out why that's the case. The USSR was quite more advanced in basically every other way than Nazi Germany. But Nazi Germany was technically a libertarian dictatorship. However, now let's move on. So, now let's move on to oligarchy. So, we just gave the people a whole lot of power by allowing them to elect the leader, the supreme leader. But now what happens when we do the oligarchy? Well, now we're visiting that expanding of the amount of people that can have political power. So, an oligarchy is a small group that shares absolute power. Alright, so basically the supreme leader role is split up amongst a group of people instead of one person. So it makes it more feasible to become an oligarch than to become a dictator or a monarch. Alright? So here we have authoritarian oligarchy. So basically, authoritarian oligarchy is really just libertarian dictatorship, except that authoritarian oligarchy, it's an oligarchy, it's not a dictatorship. So basically the same thing. So the oligarchs are elected by the people, and so are the nobles underneath them. Then we have liberal oligarchy. So basically, think about it this way: this noble class that we've kept since liberal monarchism, we're basically making the noble class take the power of the dictator / monarch. So when we have liberal oligarchy, we have a new stage in between the people and the oligarch. So think of it as like the auxiliary era. These people are just as feasible. It's just as feasible to become a member of the elected Senate in a liberal oligarchy as it was to become an officer or police officer in libertarian monarchism. All right. So we have that, and the thing is, so we have that. We have, and this Senate has basically as much power as the oligarchy itself. So basically, this auxiliary class of people have as much power as the noble class. But the noble class have already replaced the royal class. Alright? So now what about libertarian? What about libertarian oligarchy? Well, libertarian oligarchy is where the oligarchy itself is directly elected. So basically think of it this way. So you got this dictatorship, and the dictator was elected. Now you have the nobles. Nobles have taken power. They are no longer. They aren't elected during this whole time. I was wrong, but they now share the role of supreme leader across multiple people. Then you have an oligarchy dependent on basically an auxiliary class. And then you have it where all members of the oligarchy are elected directly by the people. But then now we move on from oligarchy to democracy. So this is an interesting step. This is where the noble class is finally eliminated. Basically, no one person or group has absolute power. So basically, now the Senate is the government. So the basic auxiliary class, they are now the government. So now so in authoritarian democracy, the oligarchy shares their power with the government. So there's a shared relationship. Then we move on to liberal democracy, which is where a presidential system is set up. Basically, under liberal democracy, the oligarchy is removed. But the Senate is still organized in an undemocratic way, aka a presidential system. And by the way, if you think that a presidential system is democratic in any way, you have lost your mind. It is not a very democratic system. If all you can do is elect a winner-takes-all election, you've got a big problem with your democracy. But I digress. It moves on to libertarian democracy, which is where a parliamentary system is set up. This is a much more democratic form of democracy. Basically, the idea is this. It's the elimination of winner-takes-all elections. It basically holds people more accountable and basically brings the government closer to the people. It makes the people's interests and desires more represented in the government than under a presidential system. And there are less non-elected members of a parliamentary system than there are unelected members of a presidential system. Generally. That's how things work. But that takes us from libertarian democracy, which it basically eliminates the noble class and makes the people feel more represented in the auxiliary class. And now we move on to monarchy. Alright? So monarchy is basically just a democracy. It can be authoritarian, liberal, libertarian, but it's supposed to be a libertarian democracy that gives up one of the three key powers of governance to the people. Now, what are the three powers of governance? Well, there are legislative power, executive power, and judicial power. So what does that mean? Well, first off, think of it this way. Let's take it one step at a time. What would it look like for the people to have executive power? Well, that would basically mean that any decision that the government makes, the people can vote either yes or no. And if more people vote yes than no, then that decision is passed. That law is passed. But if more people vote no than yes, then that law is stopped. They are directly saying you can or cannot enforce a particular law or decision. Same with legislative power. If you give over legislative power to the people, that means that the people are making laws through their votes and voting on those votes and voting on those laws. And then, if the government has executive power, the government can then say yes or no. And if the people have judicial power, that basically means that the entire judicial process is governed by either a jury or something similar to a jury, meaning that it becomes completely impossible to try a person for a crime without popular approval. Alright? So, an authoritarian monarchy is where only one of the key powers are given to the people. Let me give you an example. Communist Libya was an authoritarian monarchy. Alright? Communist Libya gave executive power to their people. Now, because the people did not have judicial power, there was a secret court problem and a corruption problem. But it was technically an authoritarian monarchy, which gave the people an incredible amount of power, at least politically, when compared to most other people in the quote-unquote free world. We then have liberal monarchy, alright? Which is where two of the key powers are given to the people. If communist Libya were a liberal monarchy, where the people had control over executive power and judicial power, then the main corruption problem that caused Libya to collapse would not have happened. And a lot of the human rights abuses that Libya did would also not have happened. Alright? Because the people not only would have had a say in every single law passed, they would have also had a say in every single person tried for breaking said laws. And that would have caused basically all of the human rights abuses that Libya did to not really exist, and it would have prevented the collapse of communist Libya. So, we still want liberal monarchy. Liberal monarchy is a good thing. It's definitely better than authoritarian monarchy. And it definitely empowers the people a lot more too. I mean, there's a reason it would have fixed that corruption problem. It's because the people would have been in charge. The people would have had a whole lot more power, a whole lot more say in basically everything, really. Then we have libertarian monarchy, which is basically where the government only holds an enforcement role. Now, I'm predicting what's coming next. Alright, so this does not mean that the government has no purpose, alright? The government has a purpose. It is not just a ceremonial government. Even though a libertarian monarchy is where all three forms of political power are given over to the people, monarchy is still maintaining something called a monopoly of force. They still maintain a police force. They still maintain a military. They still maintain the local bureaucracy. They might still maintain utilities and stuff like that. They may still even take taxes. But that's all they're able to do. They're not able to make laws. They're not able to approve laws. And they're not able to enforce. They're not really even able to sentence anyone for breaking those laws. So that's what a libertarian monarchy is. It's basically where almost all of the powers of a government are stripped away from the government and given straight to the people. All right? But that leads us from libertarian anarchy to authoritarian anarchy. This is where the government has been abolished. All right? So authoritarian anarchy is basically where, so we have libertarian monarchy, where all three modes of power are given to the people. That's maintained. That's maintained throughout anarchy. But the difference is that under authoritarian anarchy, there are more than one police forces and more than one militaries. And a lot of times they will combine to form militias. But you as a citizen would get to choose which one you're under, which gives you a whole lot more control in terms of in your life, basically. So basically, you have the ability to ensure personally the safety of you and your family, based off of a bunch of competing militias. All right? And so basically you have a say in how safe you are, pretty much. We then have liberal anarchy. So liberal anarchy is basically where there is an opt-out system where people can use said militias in a certain way to opt out of particular laws that might be passed that they personally disagree with. So basically, this is the removal of a tyranny of the mob, but pretty much. So if the majority of people vote to pass a certain law that you really disagree with and you don't want to live under it, then you can opt out of that under liberal anarchy. You can use a militia that also disagrees with it to opt out of that particular law. It's kind of like a near panarchist situation. And I know most of you ain't gonna know what panarchy is, but basically you get to choose what you live under, pretty much, is the whole idea of panarchy. But it's not fully panarchy, because panarchy you'd be able to choose anything, any system, but it's near panarchy. It's like legal panarchy. You get to choose the laws that you live under. Then we have libertarian anarchy. Libertarian anarchy doesn't completely remove the necessity of this, because there's going to be a few people that are just going to disagree regardless, but libertarian anarchy is basically where the primitive system of voting is replaced by a general consensus. And I know I spelled consensus wrong, but I can't. I don't know why I didn't correct that. Basically, it's the idea that instead of voting for everything, you can basically talk out and make a general agreement with everybody about a particular law that you want passed. So basically, we've gone through all 6 stages of historical materialism from a Wabian Marxist perspective. If you want to see me go through historical materialism from from a Wabian Marxist perspective on economics, then I will have the video linked in the description. Alright, like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell if you want to support the channel. See y'all.